Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second session of our Disability Awareness and Etiquette training. We are going to share some more information today, and hopefully that's going to help you. We have quite a bit of information, but I will be sending out documents to those who have registered for the webinar. So I'll send you copies of what we go over today to make it a lot easier for you to take notes. For those of you who may be listening later, there's a lot of information here. You'll be able to look at the PowerPoints and get some pointers and tips and take some notes for yourself. So I'm going to shut my video off, but I'm going to share my screen with you so that you'll see the PowerPoint and what we are doing. Alrighty, here we go. All right. Share my screen, guys, so you guys can see. There we go. We've got it down now. All right. So as I say, this is our second session for our Disability Awareness and Etiquette training. First session, we talked about disabilities and inclusion. Talked about disabilities. We've talked about culture. We've talked about a lot of different things. So this is what we talked about yesterday. We talked about the types of disabilities. We broke it down into 6 categories, talked a little bit about what each of those categories is referring to. And then we talked about some facts about disabilities and things like 1 in every 4 adults in America have a disability. Talked about inclusion culture, what it means, how do we get there? Talked about that yesterday. Now today we're going to talk about barriers and language. So first we'll talk about barriers. There are barriers to people with disabilities participating in society as a whole. So a barrier, the definition of a barrier, according to the World Health Organization, it is factors in a person's environment that, through their absence or presence, limit functionality and create disability. So basically, anything that hinders full participation in inclusion is a barrier. And there are many different types of barriers that we're going to talk about. So first we'll talk about physical. That's the most obvious barrier. If you go into a building that does not have if you're a wheelchair user, let's say, for an example, and you need to go to a building, even if you got to go, let's say City Hall, and they don't happen to have a ramp or a way for you to get in the building, that physical layout prevents you from participating. So you're not being included in the normal things that people would do, going to City Hall, going to government things or what have you. That's just the physical kind of things. And those are the obvious things. No ramps, no elevators, other types of physical things, depending upon the different disability, could also hinder people from full participation. So the second area we're going to talk about is programs and services. So I guess a good way to kind of explain what a barrier in programs and services is let's say scheduling. We'll use this webinar for an example. So although we have it scheduled to be together live at a certain time, there are some people who have disabilities that this particular time of day is not good for them. So they can register for the webinar and they don't have to attend, but go back later to listen to it when it's convenient, when they're able to, at a time frame that's good for the individual. So that's one sort of program and service example that kind of gets into how things work in different agencies and different companies to figure out what is a barrier and what can be improved or what is already working well. So the third area we're going to talk about is policies. So policies, I guess I do have a good example of a policy that the city that I was living in quite a few years ago had a policy that their workers could not help somebody filling out forms. So you go into City Hall and say, look, I need to fill out a certain form because I'm a property owner. I need some stuff I need to fill out. So I go in there, and I have already explained yesterday that I'm legally blind, so I don't see very well. So I went to the city hall. I said, I need to fill out such and such a form, and I need help. Well, she gave me the form. I said, the printing on here is way too small. Would you help me fill it out? She said, no, I can't. I said, she said, our policy is that we can't fill it out for anybody, that they have, that, you know, that's just our policy. And I said, well, I'm visually impaired, so I can't fill this out myself, and I need help filling it out, or I'm not going to get what I need to get done. So the lady's like, I could get in trouble. I could get fired for filling somebody's form out. So after speaking with a few minutes to the lady, she said, you know what, I'm going to fill it out anyway. And I said to her, if you get in any trouble at all, I said, I'm asking for an accommodation. I just need some help. She did it for me. And I said to her, if you get in trouble, let me know. I will help, and I'll come and talk to people about the fact that you are giving me an accommodation because of my disability. And that policy is not a good one. It leaves you in an uncomfortable position. So anyway, it worked out well, but it was a good example of the policy providing a barrier for me to independently fill out my form, or to get the help that I needed to fill out the form. It would have been better if there was a form that could be independent, but either way, it worked out. But it's a good example of the kinds of things that we have to look for in our companies and agencies to say, is this a hindrance? You know, so all of these barriers we're talking about, we can look at them individually and depending on the agency. It gives us something to think about. How are we providing a barrier? How are we making a barrier without realizing it? So the next type of barrier we'll talk about is communication. Now, communication is pretty big because so much today is reliant on communication. A lot of this digital age, there's so much that comes through digitally rather than, you know, in person. So, and also there's, you know, some things like print materials. Okay, this is one example. Like large print materials would be a way to communicate better to people who are visually impaired. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to, say, doctor's offices or agencies, and they have this big long form for you to fill out, and the printing is so tiny that you can't, it's impossible for me to do it, and I know a lot of other people. So finding a way to get those forms done so the person can do it independently is a good thing. But that kind of communication is one of the barriers. Websites, if websites are inaccessible to people who use assistive technology, is another communication barrier. And a lot of times when we have videos or movies, we're doing things, it's a good idea to have closed captioning and descriptive video. Now, the closed captioning would be something, you know, like for someone who is hard of hearing or deaf, they would need to read what's on the screen, what I'm saying. Let's say we do this, and it's what I'm saying is actually transcribed. Descriptive video is if you have a video and somebody's walking down the street, the video will say so-and-so is walking down the street. So that's an example. So those are just examples of the types of communication things we have to think about, the kinds of barriers we have. If we do things that are going to hinder someone from getting the information that we want to impart, then that's a barrier. So the next category is social barriers. That would be things that happen in the community or in a situation where people can't, a person with a disability cannot participate with other people. You know, doing things like going to festivals or, you know, participating in activities and things. I have an example one for myself, and is that, you know, when I was in a particular church and I wanted to be part of ministry, their only disability ministry was that they went to visit people who have disabilities and who are in nursing homes or rehab centers that needed some visitation. So I explained, you know, what I wanted. I'd like to participate in that. And the person who was heading it, I said, you know, I'm going to need, he said, oh, well, just meet us, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, I'm visually impaired. I don't drive. I don't have a car. And I have a service dog. I have a guide dog. So I would need someone to pick me up to take me. And he said, well, we can't have you come. Why don't you just stay home and be on the prayer team? So that was a social barrier because they were unwilling to have me participate with the group to go do this ministry. So that was just one kind of an example of a social barrier that I can come up with to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of things that may happen that we need to look out for that actually is a barrier to inclusion of people with disability. The next type of barrier is transportation. And transportation could come really under almost any type of barrier because it's a really big one for those of us with disabilities who can't drive. So if we don't have reliable transportation and something's going on and there's no other way to participate in whatever the activity is, transportation could be the main barrier. There's so many things that happen with participating in the community or even going to work, because if your work is in a location that is not accessible to like buses or a paratransit or something, then you're missing out on a whole segment of the population that would make great employees. So it sort of goes, it's bigger than the transportation itself. It makes a big difference. If providing transportation, whether it be public, private, whatever, so that people with disabilities can participate in all of the things everybody else does, in work and in community activities and shopping and all that kind of things. Now, one of the biggest barriers, actually the biggest barrier to full participation of people with disabilities is attitude. Attitude is the biggest disability. It is the greatest barrier. It affects so many different things. Just the attitudes that people have really can be a hindrance. Some of the ideas about attitudes would be like people have a bad stigma about people with disability. There's prejudice, there's discrimination. There's a lot of stereotyping. People think that people with disabilities are lazy, that they don't have any skills, that they're unhealthy just because they have some kind of an impairment. People believe that that attitudes, okay, so in society, attitudes may come from people's ideas related to disabilities. People may see disability as a personal tragedy. So they take it on themselves like, oh my goodness, if that person has a disability, what did I do wrong or something, especially if it's a family member. And then people think it's going to be something that has to be cured. Like I can tell you just from my point of view, and I've seen it with different other disabilities, is that so many people will be like, oh, if only you could see better and whatever. But you know what? It doesn't bother me not to see well. I've always been visually impaired. This is just who I am. This is the way I am. It's not a big deal. But people outside of my immediate family don't understand that. They just think, oh, we just got to get you better. No, this is who I am. People think that, having a disability means that something's wrong with you. Let's see. So now because even though people have had these negative attitudes, they still continue to, believe me, I get it all the time, but I know many wheelchair users, many people with disabilities who have experienced the same sort of things that people think, oh, if only you could be cured, if only this could get better, if only, no, but instead of accepting us for who we are and what we are and how we are, this is part of who we are. It's not a big deal to those of us with disabilities. Someone who's a wheelchair user, that's just what they do. That's just who they are. It's part of their makeup. So attitudes can come in many types of forms. The negative attitudes towards people with disabilities, or at least inappropriate sort of attitudes. One is fear. Okay, people might fear that they say or do the wrong thing. So they, instead of making an effort to be friendly, they just back off and not do anything. So that's kind of an attitude, that attitude of fear prevents interaction. It prevents that inclusion sort of thing. It prevents that sense of belonging, because just that fear of doing something wrong. And it's very common. So these aren't things that just, are crazy, but it's common. And if we realize the attitudes, we can do our best to change them to a healthier attitude. So the second one is backlash. That people think, there are some people who think that just because you have a disability, especially in the workplace, I've seen it happen more often, that there's some backlash. That people think that people with disabilities have unfair advantages. So if somebody with a disability because of their disability, has to have an accommodation where they work flexible hours. Well, some other people in the workplace might say, oh, that's not fair. How come they get to do it? Whatever. So that's another attitude that prevents full inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace and in the community as well. So the next one is denial. One of the ways to describe that is people who have hidden disabilities are often not looked at seriously, looked at as if they don't have a disability. People who do not have a disability, well, if you can't see it, it's not a disability. So that's a negative attitude that really can affect a lot. So they automatically think because they can't see the disability that it's not there. So they don't think about what's really happening with that person. So the next one is called spread effect. Now that's just kind of, people assume that a person with a disability is totally impaired. So one example of that would be, okay, I'm visually impaired. And then but there are people who think because I can't see well, maybe I can't hear well. So they yell at someone who can't see well because they're thinking that more than one disability is happening at once. And that happens often. So it's not like an unusual sort of thing, but it's good to be aware of it. Okay, so the next one is inferiority. People think that someone with a disability cannot take care of themselves, so they always need someone to help. I mean, granted, there are people who do need help, but we're independent in as much as we can be. Most of us can take care of ourselves. We may do things a little bit differently than somebody else, but we can take care of ourselves, have apartments, raise children, cook, clean, do the same thing everybody else does. Next one is pity. People who feel pity for a person, people who feel sorry for a person with a disability may not treat the person as an equal. So it's just something to be aware of. Hero worship. People think that person with a disability is so wonderful and great when they do ordinary things like cook or clean or do something we always normally do, like walk down to the corner or whatever. They think, oh, you're so good because you can do that. No, that's just part of life, you know? People with disabilities just want equal opportunity to earn their own way and live independently, being an equal member of society. Okay, so those are the barriers that that happen with people with disabilities. So, and now that we realize that, now let's take the first step in how we're going to change the barriers and change negative thinking to full participation. One of the first steps, and sometimes it can be a hard step, is language. What we say about and to people with disabilities, the words we use make a big difference. So, first we're going to talk about the word disability versus the word handicap. So a disability is a condition that limits a person's ability to walk, see, hear, learn, reason, whatever. But a handicap is an imposed barrier that restricts a person. So we just talked about barriers. So now if you think about those barriers, if those are things outside of the person's control, outside of a disabled person's, see, I was wrong right there. See that? I said the wrong word. Outside of the person's control that someone else puts on them, that's the handicap. So what we want to do is focus on disability and eliminating handicaps. But many people refer to people with disability as handicapped, which is, and they're only handicapped by outside. They're not handicapped in and of the fact they have a disability. Okay, so some inappropriate words. I just mentioned the word handicapped. The word handicap comes from years ago when people with disabilities had no way to make money. People wouldn't hire them. They would be on the street with a cap in hand to raise money just to support themselves. So that's where that word comes from. So nowadays it's a very derogatory, negative, rude sort of word to call somebody handicapped, because we're not. We're very capable people. And we just have a disability. The next one is bound or confined to a wheelchair. This is something that people say a lot. I do hear it often, and people don't know. I mean, the reason we're going over this is people just don't know that these words, what they really mean, and how negative they come across. So now, when someone says they're being bound to a wheelchair, that has a real negative effect. So with the but a wheelchair is not a binding or confining item. That is a freeing item. So without a wheelchair, that person probably would have to stay home, wouldn't be free to go about, to be independent, to do whatever. So the wheelchair is not a binding thing, it is a freedom thing. And that's the same thing with like someone who may use a cane. Any of our tools that we use are helping us to become more independent and more free. So the words, when people use bound or confined, it's not an appropriate way to talk about someone in a wheelchair. The word suffers from, we don't suffer from anything. This is who we are, what we have. It just happen to have a visual impairment. This person just happens to be deaf. This person just happens to be a wheelchair user. We don't suffer from MS, or we don't suffer from whatever. There may be difficult parts involved, but the phrase suffers from is an inappropriate one. Now we're talking about people who have mental health issues. Crazy or insane is just, it's an old word. It's very negative. It's very degrading. People are not crazy or insane. They may have mental health issues, may need some medication or some specific interventions, but that doesn't mean they're crazy or insane. That's negative, derogatory sort of words. Able-bodied is another word that you would think that's a positive word, but it really isn't, because it denotes that someone with a disability can't do something. It's kind of one of those words that you kind of have to really look into and say, why is able-bodied? Because so able-bodied generally refers to someone who does not have a disability. So it kind of denotes that someone with a disability is not able but unable to do things. So just one of those kind of weird words to keep in mind not to use. And the whole world of normal and healthy. What is normal? Really think about that. What is normal? And you think, oh, normal is a healthy person who doesn't have whatever, and doesn't have a vision, doesn't have a wheelchair user, doesn't have MS, doesn't have CP, can hear. But everybody has their different things. There's no real such thing as normal. What is normal? We're all unique. We're all individuals, in so many different ways. Whether you have a disability or you don't, we all are unique. There's no real normal. So these are just kind of words to keep in mind not to use when you're referring to people with disabilities. Okay. So let me see. We have the next part is the whole idea of people first language is to put the person first. Now, instead of referring to them as a disability, the disability being the main factor of who that person is and all of that, put the person first. So, and then a disability second. Like one of the phrases that would be used most is people with disabilities, a person with a disability, a person who uses a wheelchair. It emphasizes, when you use people first language, you emphasize the positive, what the person can do. Don't avoid labels like we talked about, the crazy, the insane, the mentally retarded, all those negative sort of things. We want to just speak about people with disabilities and to people with disabilities with decency and respect as a person, not as a disability. So we have, I'm actually going to, those people who have registered for this course will get this chart as their handout for today. So what we want to talk about is people first language versus the negative language. So I just mentioned about the person with a disability, instead of saying the disabled or the handicapped or something like that, that's kind of old derogatory word. A person without a disability, don't say normal person, healthy person. When you're trying to describe someone with a disability or without, just people without a disability. It's pretty simple. And it may take some time to change if you're not used to using this kind of language. It may take some thinking. Even now, I've been doing this for a lot of years. I sometimes, because of the way society is, I mess up too. So don't worry if you mess up sometimes. Just know that most of the time to use these particular phrases. So a person with an emotional or behavioral disability, a person with a mental health or a psychiatric disability is the right way to say it instead of saying insane, crazy, psycho, maniac, nuts. Those are really, those are just like you're insulting the person. Person who is deaf rather than deaf or dumb, mute. The person who is hard of hearing instead of he suffers from a hearing loss or something like that. A person who is blind or visually impaired, not the blind or that blind person or whatever. It's a person who is blind. A person with MS or multiple sclerosis, not someone affected by MS. Just happens to have it. It's not affecting them as a person. A person who uses a wheelchair rather than confined to a wheelchair, like we already talked about. A person with a physical disability rather than crippled, lame, deformed, invalid, spastic. You don't want to use any of those words. You want to put the person first. Person with epilepsy or seizure disorder rather than epileptic. Okay, it's the same sort of idea. Okay, so we have that again. Person who is successful or productive. Oops. Say person who is successful or productive rather than a person who has overcome her disability or is courageous. No, it's just successful. Either way, if someone didn't have a disability, then they're successful. You're just successful. Just because someone happens to have a disability and they're successful doesn't mean it's because of that disability that they're successful. It just happens to be what they did. And accessible parking or bathrooms. Now, I do want to talk about, okay, first accessible bathrooms rather than handicap bathroom. Okay, handicap parking. Now the signs for handicap say handicap parking, and we have in the disability community have previously tried to get that changed because it's not the correct language. However, the government doesn't want to change all of the handicap parking sort of thing, so they still call it handicap because you're just not going to change it all. But just to know that if there was a way to change it, accessible parking would be better. Or if you're referring to the parking, talking to somebody, it's better to say accessible parking rather than handicap parking. But it's one of those things that it's probably not going to change soon as far as the signage and that. But if we can change the reference to it, at least people will think of it more positively rather than handicap, because handicap denotes, as we said before, an imposed barrier. So we want to refer to as accessible parking and accessible bathrooms. Okay. So now, according all right, there we go. I'm back. So we've talked about a lot of, okay. All right. All right, so here we go. Now, after looking at that quote, so this is what we have done for today. We've talked about barriers. We've talked about people first language. So if you have any questions, any concerns, or whatever, my email address is debbie.malone@inclusioneducation.com. So just shoot me an email, let me know what your questions or concerns are, and I'd be happy to answer whatever I can. We'll work it out. Okay, thanks for attending this second session and have a wonderful day.